Namaskara. Good evening and welcome to Bangalore International Center. Today is World Day Against the Death Penalty Day, and NLU Delhi Project 39A in collaboration with Bangalore International Center has this panel comprising of child rights activist, women rights activist Khushi Kushalappa, who works with Enfold, Corinne Kumar, founder of Vimochana, R. Sri Kumar, former Director General of Police, Karnataka, and the moderators Anup Surendranath, Executive Director, Project 39A. I think I will leave it to the panel to make the introductions and to talk about.
Yeah, thank you so much. And on behalf of Project 39A at National Law University Delhi, a huge thank you to Bangalore International Center for hosting this event and having us here today. Today is the World Day Against the Death Penalty, and we felt it was an appropriate occasion to have a conversation on the on sexual violence and the death penalty. And the reason for that really is that as far as India is concerned, what is driving the death penalty is an expanded scope of more and more offenses for which the death penalty is being attracted since the 2013 amendments to the Indian Penal Code after the Nirbhaya gang rape case, right? So we are seeing a decade of an expansion of the death penalty where more and more sexual offenses are being brought under the ambit of being capital eligible offenses, right? And that is also with the acknowledgement that sexual violence as a social problem, as a cultural problem, and as a legal problem is far too obvious in our society and country and legal system. And we seem to be struggling to find effective and meaningful responses to that. And it's in that context that the death penalty comes into the conversation both politically and legally. And we felt it was important to have this conversation with people who have such wide experience in different contexts of sexual violence in our country. We have Khushi Kushalappa, who's a trained counselor and has been counseling adults and children for over 15 years. She's with the Enfold Proactive Health Trust since 2010. And as an organization, they have provided assistance to a large number of children through various stages of the criminal justice process and child protection processes. And I'm sure Khushi will have a lot of insight into what is happening into accountability for child sexual violence and what is happening under the POCSO. So thank you, Khushi, for taking time out and being here today. Welcome. Welcome to this conversation. We have Corinne Kumar. Corinne is a philosopher, poet, and human rights theoretician. She has helped establish and promote the World Courts of Women. And if you should look it up, it's a fascinating initiative whose aim is to hold governments accountable under both international law and human ethics for crimes against women and crimes of war. She's also the co-founder of the Vimochana Forum for Women's Rights in Bangalore, and the organization works on issues of domestic violence, dowry-related deaths, and workplace sexual harassment. I think for people in Bangalore, Vimochana really does not require any introduction, so but I just had to go through that. So Corinne, welcome, and thank you for taking the time out, and really appreciate you being here. Thank you. Thank you. We have Mr. R. Sri Kumar. Mr. R. Sri Kumar is the former head of police of Karnataka and served as the Director General of Police. He joined the Indian Police Service in 1973 and has very wide and deep policing experience across very different contexts. And he was also a member of the Central Vigilance Commission from 2010 to 2014. Thank you so much, sir, for taking the time out and being here. Yeah. As you can see, sorry, I should introduce myself a little bit. I'm Anup Surendranath. I'm a professor of law at National Law University Delhi, and I head Project 39A, which is a criminal justice program. A significant part of our work is on the death penalty, both in terms of representing prisoners on death row and also doing research on the death penalty and its use in India. So as you can see, the lineup of people here bring very different perspectives on this issue, and that precisely was the idea, that we get different experiences, different voices, different perspectives to speak to what is definitely a complex issue. I don't think anyone here will pretend that there are easy, quick fix solutions to the problem. And I hope all of us will manage to bring that out in front of you during today's conversation. The format for today is that I'm going to be posing a set of questions. So in that sense, there are no speeches to be made. And through that conversation, I will try and elicit reflections and responses to some difficult questions that face us as a society and as a legal system. So that will be the endeavor through the course of the evening. And therefore, I'm assuming it will keep it interesting, and we'll certainly have a Q&A at the end. So I propose that we'll carry out the conversation between the four of us for about an hour, and then throw it open to all of you for questions that you have. Great. So, Kushi, if I can start with you, and I just want to start with the broad brush questions and then try and narrow it down to the issues at hand. And perhaps it's good to start with how should we understand sexual violence in our society as a phenomenon, right? And I think questions of why does sexual violence occur in a society like ours has many different perceptions amongst the public. If you see its representation in popular culture, I think people who work with sexual violence survivors and victims will have a different set perspective as to why does this happen in our society, or any society for that matter. And if you could just, I know it's a very broad brush question, but I think it's important for the rest of the conversation to develop a sense of perspective, or at least your reflections, and I'll come to that question with all three of you. How should we understand why sexual violence occurs in society, or how would you characterize it?
Thanks, Anup. Thanks for having us, and thanks for doing this. It's rather than why is a really difficult question to answer. If I can just flip it around and say, how does this happen in our society? I think a lot of our cultural practices in India allow for sexual crimes to happen. Some of them being the inadequacy of adults to be able to speak to young people or anybody, even their own peers, about sexual violence or anything sexual. To share a sexual, I might talk very easily about a picnic, but having had fantastic sex with someone the previous night is something that I cannot even imagine talking to somebody about. Starting from there, the discomfort of people to speak about their bodies, sexuality, reproduction, contraception, these are all very, very awkward, uncomfortable things for us to speak about. And I see when this group might not be as shocked as I see sometimes, when I use words of, related to the human body where there shouldn't be any shame or any awkwardness, I can see the men more than the women, interestingly. Just, I can see them literally break into sweat. So that's the way that's the awkwardness with which people relate to or don't relate to sexuality. And I think it starts from there. And the concept of having to respect all older people, no matter how they behave. It's an age that needs to be respected, not the behavior of a person. So this misplaced respect that we're expected to have for any older person, no matter how they behave, is also something that allows for sexual violence to perpetuate, especially when it comes to child sexual violence, or even young people who are being sexually violated or sexually abused or sexually assaulted by an older person or a person in a position of power. And for the offender, it's very clear that I'm going to get away with this because I know that the person who I'm taking advantage of is going to find it very difficult to talk about this. So that's another reason, right. That's another why or a how.
Right.
I'll stop here and you can...
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So your point is that there are certain cultural practices that perpetuate the impunity for sexual violence and the difficulty of even coming to terms with sexuality, sex, and all of that, right? Yeah. Corinne, same question to you. How would you understand or explain, let's say, to an maybe a younger audience as to the prevalence of sexual violence in our society? Is it emblematic of a broader violence? Is it?
Anup, thank you for the question. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for everybody for being here. I was just thinking, is it not the worldview, the cosmology, that really binds this whole question of patriarchal power control that men have over women? And this happens in all facets of our life. From a woman who's been beaten or battered or bruised or burnt, from her right up to sexual violence, the rape, the harassment, the sexual harassment. And then we go on to the issues of poverty, of unemployment, of homelessness, and everything has the men, I think, the patriarchal worldview, because you have many women also who are patriarchs, but the men who are patriarchs, and they are the people who really control this. And if you look at any institution, since we speak so much of violence, we will speak of the institution of where then is justice. And the institution of justice, that again is so patriarchal, that it has there the power of the judges, the power of the men, the power of the lawyers, the power of jurisprudence, of national jurisprudence, that then goes into the international human rights discourse, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. All the human rights, the political and civil rights, the civic and the social rights, the economic rights of people. Everywhere you find that women and men, there are two standards. There is the masculine and there is the feminine. And it's this kind of patriarchy that I think would be one word to just answer this little question of yours, Anup.
One little word, but a whole universe of ideas in there. Yes, and I think it's what you brought to one word and the connections that it then makes. Mr. Srinkumar, that then raises very difficult questions for law enforcement, does it? I mean, doesn't it? In terms of what the law is, how the law is to be enforced, both what Khushi and Corinne spoke about. How does then the law view this, right? And how should law enforcement view this? What are clearly very complex sociological questions, cultural questions, political questions. How does that get translated into the law? And how do you view this aspect of sexual violence in our society?
Thank you very much for having me here, and good evening to all of you. I'm here as a policeman, so I'm going to be sticking to the police response. The police is there to enforce the law. And the law is, talking about a crime, for example, the law says that a crime can be either due to wine, women, or property. One of the three things. Jar, Joru, Zameen, these are the concepts. So one third of the crime is probably due to women, either whatever is the reaction. And even those crimes which are taking place in respect of property and under intoxication or some other thing, there also there will be two parties. So if there are two different genders, man and a woman, so there also the question of the sexuality will come in. There will be part of the reason why the particular crime has taken place. So we find that in every crime there will be some element of gender justice coming in, and that we have to handle. More importantly, where you have talking about violence in respect of associated with sexuality, it is a very complex thing which you have rightly discussed. And we are there only as a first responder. So it's a very big problem which even the society has not found a solution to it.
Right.
And the law is also not clear, and the law is keeping on changing. And especially since 2012, there have been so many changes brought about.
Correct.
So in that situation, the police, what they have to do, how to handle it, when you go to the crime scene and start finding out the truth of the matter, you find that it is very difficult to find out, first of all, whether it is, because the crime is committed mostly in isolation and a secular atmosphere, and there is only one person talking about the other. So you'll have to find out the truth, and then you have to collect the evidence. And the evidence is also very transient in nature. It will just evaporate into thin air if you don't capture it. And so this is probably the most difficult crime for us to handle. And so when you go on the scene of crime and then we hear the woman crying, or the kith and kin or the family talking about it and crying, you just have to show some action, and you are representing the state. So how we have to do it? So one of the things which we generally say is फांसी चढ़ा देंगे उसको. This is something which we will do. So that is where the question of death penalty comes. That I am here to you on behalf of the state, and I will ensure that some punishment will be there. So that is one thing which we need try to deal with it. But as I said, the investigation is a very, very tricky job, and we have to have a team investigation where a lot of people have to collaborate, the technical experts, the forensic experts, the medical doctor, the microbiologist, and so many other things are required. So it's a very complex thing.
Yeah.
And then they're all not working in unison. They're all working in silos. And so there is a difficulty in approaching the problem.
Right.
So in such a situation, I think we need to have a rethinking so as to how it has to be done. We need a lot of retraining, we need a lot of infrastructure support. We need to be able to handle it as an emergency case, just like during the golden hour when the person who is injured is brought in. Everything has to move in just to save. So something like that had to happen. Unfortunately, we don't have that system. Our own law of police is it is an instrumentality of the government and power, not an instrumentality of the law.
Yeah.
So that is where the problem comes.
Yeah.
I just remember one case of this Amarmani Tripathi. The other party was pregnant with his child, and after the murder, the child was seen, and then everything, and then the fetus, and not even covered, and it was not even removed. That is a very crucial piece of evidence. And the body was disposed of given for disposal. And the body was being taken away. The Commissioner of Police there came to know about this. Then he recalled for the body to be brought to preserve that piece of evidence. And then that went to prove the motive and the liaison between the deceased and the victim, etc. So now the question is, such a complex thing where the transient easily evaporatable evidence is available, and you have to collect it in time, etc. It's a very, very difficult. We need legal assistance and infrastructure to handle this.
Right. So clearly the law has certain expectations, right, that it creates through legislation and procedure and everything else. And it's certainly a question I'll come back to later in terms of then have we built the institutions in a manner to respond to the expectations of the law? And I'll come back to that. But just to take it a step behind, and I just want to go back to Kushi on that how then do you assess the law's own imagination and response to sexual violence, right? Be it the POCSO or the IPC amendments, right? Are you Are you happy with the law's imagination of sexual violence and what should be the law's response to it? Or do you think that in the legal imagination itself, all the complexity that Corinne and you spoke about, a lot of it just gets missed?
I'll say after having worked,
Yeah.
after having worked in for 11 years, it's not a lot compared to many people that I know of, including the people that I have on the panel here. But POCSO was enacted after I started working with Enfold. So we kind of grew with POCSO. And it's 10 years, good or bad, it's 10 years down POCSO this year. And but after all of this, and I have the confidence to walk into any police station today. I'm not at all nervous to walk into a police station. But if something were to happen to somebody that I know, do I have the confidence to walk into any one of these police stations and say, sir, register a case? Do I want to put a person through that? Is a question that I always sit with. With mandatory reporting, we are faced with this dichotomy of whether to push a family or a child into the criminal justice system or any
Do you want to
survivor.
just explain what mandatory reporting is? I'm not sure if everyone.
So the POCSO Act, the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, which was enacted in 2012, 10 years to the year today, brought in what was in Section 19, something called mandatory. It doesn't say mandatory reporting, but anyone with information, knowledge, or apprehension of a sexual crime against a child is required to report it to the authorities, and the authorities being nothing less than the police. So this is a non-negotiable. And if I am sitting with information of a child, or I suspect that a child is facing sexual violence, I'm required to report it to the police. And if I don't, there is punishment of 6 months to a year, depending upon what my relationship with this with a child is. So if I'm a head of an institution, then it's 1 year. If I'm a lay person who doesn't head an institution, then it comes down to about 6 months. So there is this dagger of mandatory reporting that is hanging over every single citizen of the country or any person who is living on Indian soil when that particular sexual violence occurred. And the same has now also been extended to rape of adults. Is that right? There is mandatory reporting that the police, that a person, a medical officer, for example, if I, as an adult, went and sought medical assistance, treatment for a sexual crime, the doctor is required to inform the police. Now, whether the family takes that forward or not is still, there is some amount of flexibility with that. But when it comes to a child, there is no flexibility. Even as a child, if I were to seek treatment from a medical doctor or therapy from a mental health professional, or if I were to seek termination of a pregnancy, any of these conditions would require the doctor or the examining doctor to inform the police, and nothing less than the police. And now, after 10 years, the police almost always themselves register a case. Yes or no? I take that back completely. It's not always that the police register a case. There are many instances where the police might not think it is in the interest of the victim. I would like to give the police the benefit of doubt and say that sometimes they believe it's not in the interest of the victim to register a case. If it is, for example, something that has happened very long back. If it's something that has happened recently, then there is a possibility of being able to get some amount of medical evidence or some amount of something that can strengthen the final report of the police themselves. But if not, there are times when the police will say, are you sure you want to do this? And this is something that comes up a lot when it's cases of incest. When it is something that's happening within the family. Because what reporting does to a family member who is reporting against another family member is devastating. I'll stop here. I'm sure others have.
But if you can just say, no, I'm just going to play the devil's advocate here. What is so bad about mandatory reporting? If there is such a crime that has happened to a child, surely we want it. Why don't we want it reported to the police? I mean, yes. So if you can just, yeah. I mean, just to make it.
So I don't think our system is geared to handle the amount of cases that we should be receiving. If there was mandatory reporting and everyone was respecting mandatory reporting, the number of cases that we should be receiving would be tenfold compared to what we're getting. So that's not happening, honestly speaking. And in the confidence of this room, I will say there have been situations when we have not reported every single case that came, that was brought to our attention. The system is not at all geared like we are aware that infrastructure, staffing, training, sensitivity, empathy, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that front. So just pushing someone and saying no mandatory reporting, there is good about mandatory reporting as well. If there hadn't been mandatory reporting, there were so many cases where children were facing extreme forms of sexual violence which would have never seen the light of day. The child would have continued to or that person would have continued to face sexual violence. But because of mandatory reporting, there is some amount of protection, but our system is not ready for mandatory reporting.
Okay. I'll come back to some of those points that you raise on what do survivors need, and is it just about pushing this into the criminal justice system, and are there other... Corinne, over to you. You spoke about the fact that it's a very patriarchal worldview, and clearly the law on sexual violence and rape has undergone an evolution over decades. How do you assess that legal evolution, right? In your experience of these many years, are we at least headed in the right direction in terms of how the law is responding to sexual violence, or do you still think it's a very patriarchal view of violence per se? And yeah.
I think it's a patriarchal
Yes.
view of...
Mike.
Oh. I think it's a patriarchal view of justice and
Right.
of violence also, but of justice, because I think, colonization, no doubt, it restructured our economy and our political structures, where also became different. But what it also colonized, what it also let us just gave away our minds and our imaginations also. And therefore, our imagination can only be within the colonized paradigm, within the kind of colonial discourse. That's what most of us are looking at justice today. When we look at the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, you talk about universal. Everybody has a right to work. Everybody has a right to life. Does everybody have a right to life, friends? Think of the neutron bombs that are simply tested in the Pacific. Mothers producing masses of flesh that breathes. These are called the jelly babies of Micronesia. Children that are already dead before they are born. What does the right to life mean? What does the right to a home mean? What does the right to work mean? And it's a universal right, we are told. We are all equal, we are told. We have political democracy. We all have the right to vote. But economically, our economy works in such a way that a few must have and the many must fall out of it. So, friends, there is something in the kind of colonial discourse, I think, Anup, that we really need to look at. And we really need to look there at this whole concept of justice. Even the concept of justice, I would say, you'd think I'm very terrible to say this. But I'm thinking of justice that is so masculinized. It's so hyper-masculine. It leaves out there are, after all, 2 points in our consciousness, the feminine and the masculine. But what does the masculine lawyer tell you as you go to tell them what you did or what your case was about or whatever? He will put it in a language that is so legal that you do not recognize the crime anymore. And that this is the kind of objectivity that the lawyers will teach you about, that Anup will teach his students about. Objectivity, he will tell you, not subjectivity. You cannot be lyrical, you have to be logical. You cannot be unscientific, you have to be scientific. You have to be objective. You have to really look at what is there before you so that you can touch it, you can feel it, you can rationalize it. But you don't have to intuit it. Doesn't matter the wound on you, doesn't matter your rape, doesn't matter the grief that you have. Who talks about the grief of Bilkis Banu? Who talks about it? We don't even recognize it. None of us even think about it. But we think in terms of justice. Was justice done? Then they gave sweets when they came away. And everybody, at least some of the demonstrations that I heard about, I went to, they wanted them to be rearrested. They wanted them to be put back in jail. But I am saying today that jail of 14 years or 15 years doesn't seem to have worked very much. If it hasn't worked, must we not then find other sites of pain which take in the emotive and link it with the rational, to link the rational with the intuitive, to link the subjective with the objective, to link the logical with the lyrical? Because if we do the personal with the political, because if we don't do this, then we are depriving ourselves of an ethics, of another word which nobody uses anymore, because they think that there's something wrong with you if you even talk about ethics or ethicality or anything ethics in politics. There's no ethics in politics. But there has to be an ethic of care. Because if we have you can have the Millennium Development Goals, poverty reduction strategies, anything we want to say on poverty. But if it doesn't have a theory of care, you will simply leave the poor out.
Thanks, Corinne, for that provoking us to think about the idea of justice, right? And I guess we could just go on for hours about that itself. But I think it's so integral to this conversation, right? That what is the idea of justice that the law itself imagines, and that each of us imagine as to what constitutes justice in these contexts, and something that we'll be coming back to. So Mr. Srikumar, in terms of what we just heard from Kushi and Corinne, that survivors and victims have that we could imagine what is required in a very broad sense, but the law, as you rightly said, first of all, seems to be stuck in a certain imagination. And even in that imagination, our institutions say something like the POCSO, right? I guess many of us would feel that it was a child-friendly legislation, right? But what has happened to that child-friendly legislation in terms of the various provisions of it, that the legal system is unable to even give effect to that legal imagination, even assuming that that legal imagination is limited. But even to that limited imagination, our institutions are not able to deliver that, right? And then are we then stuck pursuing a vision of justice that is then primarily only retributive or deterrent, and in that sense is very offender focused, right, and has very little to do with what survivors or victims need, because that's all that our system can afford to do or is able to do.
To a large extent, I agree about patriarchality and universal rights, etc. But then I have a little different take on the whole thing.
Yeah.
The fact is, the concept of rule of law itself, that law has to be applied irrespective of whoever you are and whatever you are. Now, please tell me, if you had the POCSO law and I am the doctor in the PSC and a child comes to deliver a child, and I can make out that she is a child and she is carrying. Now, I am mandatory to report the case. Same way, if a person is rescued from a den and so many other things, she talks about how she was kidnapped from a particular village and all the way from Bihar or Bengal and Jharkhand, you came over to Bangalore. Now she reveals to me all the other atrocities that have been committed on me. For a long time, I can keep on registering each and every case and start pursuing all the 100 cases which may have to be resulting from one statement of one person. The system is not ready for that. infrastructures are not there, institutions are not there, there is no way I can handle this. No way the society can also handle this.
Correct.
So, in my scheme of things, there is something called rule of law and there is something called the rule of engagement. The rule of engagement is there very much in the other countries. We don't even talk about it much. Where by escalation, depending on the situation, we will apply the bomb what is required to be given depending on the situation. So there will be a situation response depending on the thing. So we have to have both rule of engagement and the restorative justice. Like for example, instead of just registering an FIR and then immediately then I have to investigate the case, I find that it is true, then I have to arrest the accused. That was the way it was earlier. You have to mandatorily arrest the victim. Now only the thing has started coming saying that you don't have to arrest the accused. But 30 years back, 40 years back, unless you arrest the accused and charge sheet him, he will not be available for trial. So just to take away the responsibility out of my shoulder, I will arrest and put him behind bars along with the charge sheet. So the question is, when the institutions, not only the police, the doctors, the forensic experts, everybody who is dealing with it, child psychologists, counselors, we don't have that institutions. So we cannot be rushing with these laws like Disha law. I mean, they passed the law in 1 month to say that you have to finish the investigation in 3 days, 3 weeks time. Yes, we finished the case of Rajiv Gandhi assassination in one year's time, as per Tada. The trial judge who was handling only one case, he handled it for 3 years before pronouncing judgment of death penalty on 26 accused. And afterwards, the 7 years the appellate court took, which is the Supreme Court, all the Tata cases went straight away. And they took, and ultimately they have also said death penalty has to be thing. But the system is not geared to handle all these cases. There have been so many cases.
Yeah.
So we need to think of some other alternative solution.
So yeah, I mean and that's an important point in terms of what are the limitations of the system. And given the system's limitations, it seems then focused towards a certain view of justice, which is a very punishment-focused view of justice, right? In that sense, just to take the conversation forward, Khushi, who is seeking justice in these cases, right? When I say who is seeking justice, very often the perception of who must be brought to justice is that of a stranger committing sexual offenses against a child or an adult woman, right? How true is this perception that what we are really dealing with are stranger rapes, or is that not, or does the data not play that out? What is the reality on the ground? Because then it affects the question of who is seeking justice against whom, right? And currently our public imagination is that a stranger has committed sexual assault and there is this.
If I may raise a question, I think 80% of the perpetrators are somebody from known to the
Right. So
family.
So I just wanted, Khushi, to just reflect on what is the consequence of that then, right? Depending on who is seeking justice from whom and is seeking what justice, what does this legal imagination then do to that, right?
Can I answer the what? It doesn't capture everything that every victim or survivor has probably expressed. But I think the what, there's a range of what they hope to get from the criminal justice system. Ranging from really high punishments, I want this person to remain in jail for the rest of their life, to okay, some punishment has to happen. At the very least, I want the people in the village, I want the people in my mohalla, in my area, to know that this person did it. I want to be believed. I want to know that they're not blaming me for what happened. These are all different perceptions of justice, and I think depending upon the socioeconomic strata, the conditioning, the age of the child, the relationship with the offender, all of these play out in what a person looks for in terms of justice. And I don't think victims really feel that they've got justice. So there was a 2013 case of ours where the child was about 13 and a half or 14 when she got assaulted by this person who was from her village. She was a child with intellectual disabilities of a mild this thing. So she had the developmental capacity of a 5-year-old, but in terms of understanding, comprehension, speaking, memory was outstanding. So this 2013 case got convicted about, the accused got convicted about 3-4 weeks ago. After a long wait of close to 9 years, the girl is now 22 years of age. She remembers the things that happened with her. She knows the person. She used to refer to the person in a certain way. So she says that this particular person has, she heard the talk around saying that this person has now been sent to jail. Now this person already was in judicial custody for the first 2-3 years of the, as soon as the case broke, and then eventually the person did get bail and he was out on bail, would be seen walking around in the village, etc. At some point, this person also got married, the offender, the alleged offender, has a wife and a child. Now, this mother of this child who waited for justice for 9 years was very happy that he was convicted, and the punishment was 10 years. So she was satisfied with that. I would say she was satisfied with that. But at the end of the conversation, she said, Amma, when I see that man's wife, who was not even aware of what his history was, and she's now with a young child. Now, if this man goes away for 10 years, who's going to look after this woman, and what is their fault? So this sense of justice, or this justice that she has received after 9 years, as I said, a bit hollow for her. She's so conflicted.
Yeah. No, I think that captures the complexity of this so profoundly. And Corinne, do we often run into this problem that there is an homogenization of this idea of justice, right? That survivors or victims are primarily interested in ensuring the highest punishment for the offender, right? That there is this, and very often society and the state assume that, right? They say that it is on your behalf that we are pursuing these punishments, this harsh punishment. But do we, in that, forget that that different people in different situations have varying understanding of what justice means, and what are some of these different conceptions of justice that people in such situations comprehend? And yeah, if you could just speak to that.
I think, friends, we need to imagine justice differently. We need to reimagine justice, not look at it within the kind of set, hyper-masculine, logical paradigm that we see, but to really think in terms of not only a retributive justice, a justice with revenge, a justice, if I have killed somebody, then I must be killed. I need the death penalty. You have to do violence to me also. And, we need a justice that will seek reparation, I believe. A justice that seeks redress. A justice with a kind of healing. Because, we never talk of the grief of the women, grief of the children, grief of the LGBTQ, grief of people, the sex workers, the transgenders, the all kinds of homeless people, the poor people, the grief that they have, the grief of Bilkis Bano today, the grief that she has. How do we respond to that? Can there be a justice that is more restorative? Shiv used this word when we were talking outside, but more restoring a kind of a healing, a justice with healing, a justice that will give me the kind of reconciliation that I need. Is there anything to look for this kind of justice? And that's why I want to, if I may, just take 2 minutes more, Shiv and Anup, and just tell you a little bit about what we've tried to do for the last 25 years, is we've held what we call the courts of women. And the courts of women that listen to the testimonies of women, that listen to the testimonies of pain, of violence, but they also listen to the testimonies of resistance, the testimonies of reconciliation, the testimonies of celebration. Because women are also there. Women, the LGBTQ, the homeless people, all the people that we work with, the migrant workers. We're doing one in December on COVID. And there you will have the migrant workers who seek a healing. And this is what the justice system cannot see. They cannot understand the healing part of it. No lawyer will talk about the healing of a case. What does it mean? Because when we in the courts give place for the emotion, give place for the emotive demands, these emotive demands then become a kind of place which open the door to look at the masculine and the feminine and all the genders in between also. So, friends, that we need to relook at justice, to look at justice that will not only speak truth to the power, to those who use, abuse, misuse power, but truth also to the powerless, because this is from the fabric of powerlessness. Another imaginary is being woven. I could tell you a little story. I don't know if I can. Do I?
Please.
Can I?
Please.
Anu?
Please, go ahead.
It's a story from Argentina, and it starts with Carlos Rueda. I'll start with him. It's Argentina during the time of the dictators, and Carlos Rueda is a little man, and he loves children, and he loves the children's theater, and he loves acting for children, and he has his wife Celia, and Celia is a reporter, a journalist, and one day this is the time of the dictators. And so it's very, very, it's very hard for them, because people are all over Argentina talking about people who are missing, people who are dead, people who have gone astray, people they cannot find anymore. And the gift is that he can be a focus, the locus, if you like, the focus of a dream. So he can sit in his garden and he starts to tell stories of people whom people have missed somewhere. People who have gone in the death penalty, people who have paid a price somewhere, people who have disappeared. And then he gets news that his wife has been arrested, and his wife has been arrested by the dictators, and she disappears. But Carlos knows that it is only in his imagination, friends, that he can keep her alive. Because what stands between us and fear is our imagination. Because imagination makes us think like sheep when we should be dreaming like poets. And that's what Carlos tried to do. He tried to dream like a poet. He tried to reimagine something. He reimagined what justice could be. What could justice be for those many, many people who did not have a home, for those thousands of people who were simply poor and homeless, who missed people? And this began the women in black somewhere. The women were the white scarves. They wore white scarves. And that gave way to the women in black. And we have the women in black in Bangalore also, please. Please come when we have the women in black. But it's because the women in black stands against all wars, stands against all violence, stands against violence, and seeks a new way to justice. And that's what we're trying to do now.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Corinne. Mr. Srikumar, very often it feels like that this very textured and very layered understanding of justice and what survivors and victims need is often appropriated by the state, right? And that there is a certain conception of justice and the needs of justice of survivors and victims that the law cannot reflect, does not reflect, and we heard about that, right? But yet there is one certain conception that both society and state appropriate from the victim, and it is that justice means punishment. And that is the dominant understanding of justice, right? That it means harsher punishment, harsher and harsher punishment. how do you view this relation in the legal system, that the state often justifies what it does in the name of the victim, right? And do you see that as inevitable, or do you see that as even appropriate, or is that problematic?
It's a big problem. So I would not like to go that way at all, but that is the law of the land. So when you're talking of justice, it has to be tempered with mercy, it has to be empathetic, etc. Every time when we arrest an accused in any case, including sexual violence case, if we bring the two parties together, all that they say is, give the man to me for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. I will have my revenge on him. That's enough. That's all exactly what I want. But that we cannot do it. So, in fact, some of my constables also say that we use the lathi just to say that you don't beat, I will beat him, I am hitting him for you. So, the state is appropriating the thing on the behalf of the victim. So, unless we have a system where the victim has a say in the type of punishment that has to be meted out. So that is where I have been talking about restorative justice as a system which we need to legislate upon and think about all the consequences and all the complexities in it and provide for it. That, in fact, in the panchayat system, for example, where there used to be a sexual violence case, and the panchayat will sit and say that this is what is the atonement which you have to do, and probably the victim went more satisfied than the present system where you are forced to say that I will take over your grief, and then and that grief is getting sorted out only in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years time.
Right.
So I think we need to have a full scale review and bring in such practices like restorative justice, where this thing, victim also has some say in what is required and what is not.
Right.
And most important, the victim is always looking for an apology.
Right.
I am sorry at least. So that is where we need to move in. We need to move in. And especially when given our numbers, it is impossible for us to think of infrastructure for everything to do the way the law is thinking of as of now.
Right. Yeah, so that imagination that we have a certain idea of justice that the law is pursuing, right? And then you have, as Khushi and Corinne were saying, that it is difficult to say that justice just means one thing, and you could have different contexts, you could have different realities where victims and survivors need very different things, and one of those different things could be that they want the perpetrator or the offender to be punished as harshly as possible. That could very well be somebody's expectation from the justice system. I'm not denying that. That could very well be. But I think what ends up happening is that what is then projected is that is somehow the dominant demand or need of victims and survivors. Khushi, in terms of this reality that we discussed, that we are not talking of either in terms of adult rape or in terms of child sexual violence. The data is quite clear, as Sri Kumar sir was also saying, that it is not stranger rape, right? It is acquaintance rape. What does introduction of the death penalty do into this context, right? And you already alluded to that underreporting is already a problem. So this move of the legal system to say that our best response to sexual violence is harsher and harsher punishments, to bring more offenses and make them capital eligible, what does it do to this complex reality that you're already seeing on the ground?
Sexual crimes are extremely nuanced. And by and large, in the public, I think the perception of sexual violence is rape. But it is so much more than rape. It is a range, and rape might happen maybe after a certain number of months, years, whatever. But the way it begins and the grooming process and this power, this control, the exploitation, that's a whole journey before probably the final act of rape happens. And in that journey, I think there is so much of confusion that the person goes through, because according to the 2021, 2019, 2020 data, in penetrative sexual assault, the percentage of known offenders is 95%. So when we're talking about 95% of offenders known to the victims or the survivors, then the amount of guilt that victim or survivor carries when you're talking about increased punishment. So that's one thing, that for a child to know that they have sent, or the possibility of life imprisonment or death penalty is a reality, is something that weighs very heavily on a person who's reporting, including a family member. So I don't know whether the child and the family actually want like higher punishments. They do want punishment. I'm not saying that they don't. And there has to be accountability. These are crimes that really traumatize a person for a very, very long time, especially when they don't receive the kind of services that they deserve or that they need. Then the trauma continues for a very long time. So there's no taking away from some amount of accountability or punishment that needs to be given to a person who commits sexual crimes. But when you have higher punishments, then the burden of establishing that crime did occur, when for a judge who's sitting there to say that I want to give life imprisonment, 20 years, 10 years, death penalty, the amount of evidence, that the circumstantial evidence, the statement, the consistent statement of the victim from beginning to end, which is 3, 4, 5 years sometimes, all of that is almost impossible to expect in our criminal justice system.
Yeah.
And our public prosecutors are terribly overburdened. Our courts are terribly overburdened. They don't have the sensibilities to be able to pick up on nuances of the child's expression, the victim's expression, looking at we don't have those kind of these things. We don't have the tools that are required to get a young child to speak about some of their experiences.
Yeah.
So how do you then hope for convictions? The point of saying that, okay, we're going to have like these very high punishments is so that as a deterrent. I don't believe it's a deterrent.
Right. Because I guess as we started the conversation, the very nature of that violence as to why it occurs is so complex, right? It is not just very simplistic. If you just provide the punishment, the violence is going to stop, right? Then it's not going to be that. And Corinne, do you and I just as we wind towards the end of this conversation, I just want to circle back to what you started with, this in the patriarchal understanding of justice, and connect it back to how we view our response to sexual violence, and even on the spectrum of violence against women, that the response to sexual violence is very different from, let's say, domestic violence or dowry or dowry-related deaths. You see that very different reaction and intensity of reaction to these offenses. Does it tell us something about how society is reacting to sexual violence in a certain way? Does it explain that? But we seem to be reacting very differently to other forms of gender-based violence. Could you just comment on that?
Anup, I'm not sure I understand your question, because I think dowry violence is also sexual violence. Beating and battering a woman is also sexual violence. And the kind of violences that women really experience and are perpetrated on them, it's also sexual violence.
Right.
So I don't see what really is your question, Anu?
No, that rape, right, gets a certain reaction from the society and the state, right, which it does not get, which domestic violence and dowry-related deaths don't get, right?
Yes.
Right, that rape gets a certain...
Okay. Oh, this is what you mean.
Yeah.
I think because domestic violence has been
Corinne, if you just hold up
privatized.
the mic.
it's been privatized and domesticated. You know, it's personal violence. A policeman will tell us when we go there with cases there, but that's a personal violence. He's beating her, he's talking with her like this, he's using these kind of sexual terms on her, but that's personal violence. So personal violence, women's violence, violence against women has been personalized and privatized, and that it has been refused its public face. Had refused its political significance. Think about it. Half of humanity are women. Half of humanity are women, transgenders, whatever. But you know, when you think about it, you can simply be, you can just know where the whole legal system, this thing of jurisprudence has gone. National jurisprudence has gone in a kind of way that it's almost very difficult to retract this, to bring this back.
Right.
So I don't know if this in any way responds to what you're talking
No,
in
it is.
terms of.
Yeah.
Yes? Yes, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't
Yeah.
know.
So, Mr. Srikumar, just the last question, and before we open up for audience questions. Now, with all of this, right, and we see the conversation that accused persons have too many rights, right? Chief justices have said it, prime ministers have said it, right? That, you know, to achieve justice for victims, we need to do away with some rights for accused persons, right? So that I assume the logic is that we need to get more convictions, right? To try and get this justice. But is it a binary? I mean, really, are problems related to justice and access to justice, and we've had that very complex and nuanced discussion, are those going to be solved by taking away rights of accused? And do you think that is the way in which the law should evolve, that we need to reinterrogate whether we're giving too many rights to the defense?
I'm not against any right being given to an accused. We have more and enough and more. I'm only talking about the victim's rights,
Right.
vis-a-vis the accused right. Like, for example, you will have a legal help given for an intervention in the death penalty case, death row accused. A person who is not even concerned with the case, he comes as a busybody with a PL and he can stop the death penalty being carried out. Whereas the same right is not being made available to the victim. So that is why I am saying that we should have more victim-oriented solution. And more important is what Kushi talked about, that rape is only the last thing. There are so many other nuances coming in before that. Like, for example, it starts with a stalking, and then some teasing and so many other things, and some violent activities also coming, and ultimately when the person wants to force himself, it goes into a rape situation. I was reading the good things which are coming out of 1098, which has been launched in Uttar Pradesh some time back. So they, especially with the advent of the phone and so many other things, cyber stalking and so many things have happened. There are threats and extortions and so many other things are also happening. But one of the things which they are doing in the call center, the call is given it to somebody else, and they start talking to the stalker to caution the person. And some of the times these things have actually led to solving of the problem before it became bigger.
Right.
That is where the question of rule of engagement as against the rule of law
Right.
comes in.
Yeah.
So before you allowing it to fester into a rape, you intervene,
Right.
caution and stop.
Right. And therefore, the legal system's interest is very much reactive in
Yes,
sense, right? It is not
Yes, it is not
preventive in any sense.
And then, in fact, they have gone to the extent that they do the follow-up on the activities of the stalker for about 6 months.
Yeah.
And then probably give a gap of another 6 months and come back to check whether he's stalking.
Right.
These are all something wonderful which is happening
Right.
thanks to the digital world and things like that. So that's why I have been talking of a digital depository where everything has to be recorded, and of course
Right.
privacy and other issues are also to be given. But then here is a repository from where you can deal with the situation as it is demanded.
Right.
And start with the minimum.
Yeah.
And
Understood.
keep escalating it as it is required.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you everyone for those responses and reflections. And I guess the idea was to try and see how these philosophical considerations, these sociological considerations, either are reflected in the law or are not reflected in the law, and to lead to that larger reflection itself of what are the limits of law, what can criminal law achieve and what can't criminal law achieve, right? And in that sense, how do we then take these very complex considerations and find its reflection in the law? And as far as accused rights and rights of survivors or victims are concerned, I think it's often presented as a false binary. I think it is very true that torture exists in our criminal justice system, manipulation of evidence exists in our system. That is also a reality at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, it's as much a reality that filing of FIR, a timely investigation, a fair investigation, a fair trial are also very difficult for victims, right? So both of those are realities, and I think it serves no one's cause to somehow say that the very common public narrative that, you know, we need to ensure rights for victims by taking away rights of the accused. So look, I think there have been many strands of the conversation here that could do with a lot more conversation and depth, and I'm sure some of that will be picked up in the audience questions now.
Hi, my name is Mama. Thank you so much for this insightful conversation. So my question is that, you know how death penalty adds to this whole idea of demonizing abusers and seeing abusers in a certain way, right? I think that prevents a lot of victims to report abuse, but let alone even report abuse, but also, you know, recognize that they're being abused. So especially in cases that are known, you know, the abuser is known to the victim. So what do you think can be done about shattering this entire image of that is created around like abusers being these bad people who can do no right or being of a certain class or a caste, you know, what can be done about that?
That they're not human beings at all. They're not worthy of being human beings.
Jairam, how do you break the link between the right to justice and the right over the life of the victim, of the accused?
I was a little confused about some of the comments that was made, especially the contradiction between what Kushi was saying, if I may use your first name, and Mr. Srikumar's very different response. To start with, I was taken aback when Mr. Srikumar in his initial comments didn't talk about prevention of crime, but only about punishment and detection, etc. But getting away from that, towards the end when he talked about how stalking can be reduced if not prevented by using information technology methods, if I may use that phrase, when Kushi was saying that 95%, I don't know whether that figure is correct, are by perpetrators who are known, if not well known, to the victim. So we're not talking about that 95% at all if we're talking about stalkers, because stalking rarely occurs with respect to people that you know well. I wonder if someone can respond to that.
Yeah, we'll just take one more question and then we'll go for a round of responses. Yeah.
Hi, my question is for Srikumar sir.
The name.
Pavni. Sir, I have some very limited experience litigating in Delhi, but from what I saw, what used to happen in the POCSO cases was that there were at least 2 to 3 NGOs. Then there was the DCPCR lawyer. Then you also have the victim's private lawyer sometimes. to the extent that these lawyers would fight amongst themselves for the wakalatnama, who is representing the victim. But when you talk about the accused, it'll be a very reluctant lawyer from the legal aid panel representing the accused. So I'm just wondering how accurate this perception is that there's always this busybody trying to stop these things from happening to the accused, but there's nobody on the side of the victim. When you have the state, you have private organizations, you have private lawyers, you have the state government's own panel of lawyers. So maybe this is true only of Delhi, I'm not sure, but I'm just wondering the accuracy of this perception. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So, Shrikoi, so you want to just respond to that
I just
first?
want to respond
Yeah.
to one thing. I find that we are trying to enlist the service of prosecutors. We don't get anybody. Whereas everybody wants to go and be a defense lawyer, the best lucrative profession is a defense lawyer. So I don't even get a proper prosecutor who will present my case. That's my experience.
Okay. Let me just come in on that to say that defense lawyering is lucrative when your client is rich, right? And I think the point that Pavni was raising is also that if you look at the profile of people who are accused persons, right, is also then reflective of a certain class of people and a group of people where representation becomes a very real issue. And then you see in case after case after case as to how there is very poor representation. And this is not to say that poor representation is a problem only for the accused, right? I think poor representation is a problem that pervades the legal system, right? Be it for survivors or victims' families. And I think, again, we get into that binary of accused versus victim. And it really depends on who is seeking the lawyer, right? Certain groups of people and classes of people get access to representation because of certain factors. And a large section of this country does not get access to proper representation, irrespective of which side of this, which end of the spectrum of the criminal justice system you're on. And I think that's a problem. So if I might just come back to, was it Vama? Yeah, Vama's question on, and Corinne, would you mind taking that, that very often there is a need we end up demonizing the accused person, that somehow there is a need for the treatment that we want to mete out, the punishment, this certain conception of justice that we need to mete out. We need to dehumanize the accused person, right? And only once we dehumanize can we subject certain people to certain kinds of treatment. Any response to that conception of justice? Yeah.
You know, Anup, thank you for that. Because what comes to my mind immediately is the case of Afzal Guru. You know, he was not only demonized, he was made a victim, a terrorist, even before. I mean, he was not even there at the scene of the crime, but a piece of paper that gave his telephone number, that got him arrested, and that got him put in jail, and that finally put him to the death penalty. You know, that it went all the way. That is the trajectory that we have of justice today. A man kills, a man does a wrong, a woman does a wrong, you arrest them, torture them, solitary confine them, death row is the kind of, that's the trajectory of justice. Now, what you have been talking about, as what I have been trying to allude to, is another system of justice, which is a justice not of revenge, not of retribution, not of punishment, but a justice of reparation, a justice of reconciliation. Now, these Bilkis Banu, the 10 or 11 men that did this to her, raped her, killed her child, all this kind of thing. I don't want them to be rearrested. I don't want them back in prison. But I do think that we have to put them in a place where maybe they would, I don't know, to use words today is so meaningless in some ways, but the grief of that Bilkis Banu felt. Of course, she made her own life and this, that, and the other, but still, to recognize the grief, to feel sorry for that. And he should feel sorry, and they should understand what they have done. And that takes another way to justice, another way of understanding life, another way of imagining justice, because not with punishment. You kill, you must be killed. You rape, you must be raped. This is not the answer to anything. That is a crime in itself. So, friends, I really think that this is a very good question that we have to have a quote on, is what is this new system of justice? What does it include besides the reparation, besides the restoration of peace, but also of healing? The healing of the woman inside, the healing of the child, the healing of the men, the healing of people of all genders, the healing inside. And that it gives me then the strength to live again. I don't know if this makes sense to anybody.
No, it does.
Doesn't make sense.
It does make sense. It challenges us. That's all. Yeah.
I could talk much more, but I don't dare do this because Anup will say enough.
So, no, thank you. Khushi, if I may ask you to respond to Mr. Manmohan's question, that is the law responding not to the 95% cases, that it is not, the law is assuming a reality of the 5% of the cases and not really responding to the reality of the 95% of cases, which is then known persons or family members, or right, that the law's response is to then the very narrow category of those 5% of cases of stranger rape in its imagination and in its solutions. Yeah.
It's not only the law, I think it's the society also that is gunning for those people who are not known. We don't want to deal with the fact, we prefer to deny that our society is so depraved that such a huge percentage of the cases are known by known people. So then we'd rather focus on the people who are unknown. We would make a much bigger, not when I say me, I also feel that the media is also in some way responsible for sensationalizing these cases in a certain way. I mean, it doesn't need to be sensationalized. It can be victim centric. It can be things that empower a person to come forward and report. It can also send a very strong message out to the offenders. It doesn't need to be sensationalized. So somewhere the media is also responsible or irresponsible in some situations where there is so much of focus on an incident and not what happened before and not what happened after. And the criminal justice system has to respond to the 100%, whether it's the known section or the 5% unknown section. They don't have a choice. But there also the preference is to deal with the 5% and not deal with such harshness with the known people, because the family itself is so conflicted. The child, I will repeatedly talk about children because that's my area of expertise. The children are so conflicted about reporting because the responsibility of reporting against a known person weighs on them, and people don't let them forget that. The entire family and the society, the neighborhood, everyone says that you are the person who sent that person off to jail. Couldn't we have spoken about this? And attempts would have been made to speak about it, but they didn't receive the kind of response.
Right. Mr. Srikumar, any response to that question, that the law seems to be far more adept at responding to stranger rape, right? And it can't or is not able to deal with the complexity of acquaintance rape and acquaintance violence, and therefore is not sufficiently preventive in nature, right? It is very much reactive in nature. It is, and therefore has no option but to be, but to adopt this certain very narrow conception of justice.
I mean, there is some truth everywhere. And because of that only, I put it bluntly by saying that the whole criminal justice system is only tailored to favor the person who is moneyed and things like that. And real justice is not being given. And even though in most of the cases only some justice is required, saying that I just need somebody to tells me that they're sorry, things like that, apologize or do some cleaning as they do in the Gurdwara, something like that, some atonement of the thing. That is what is required.
Yeah.
And these systems are very much prevalent in India. It's part of the culture, especially the Panchayat Raj, Sarpanch and the Nyay Panchayat, which was system.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, all those things have been taken away.
Yeah.
And they are not in thing. So we need a wholesale change in the criminal justice system. We've been crying for police reforms.
Yeah.
And nobody is even talking about police reforms.
Yeah.
Police officer like Mr. Prakash Singh and my once upon a time my guru, we fought and fought.
Correct.
And we have now retired and we have gone away. We have not seen system change coming. So unless some systemic changes are brought about and access to justice both for accused and the victim is very much required.
Required.
So we need to think afresh.
Right.
This is the total rota system, it has to be changed.
Right. I think both police reforms and prison reforms are two areas which have been spoken about since colonial times, and very little has happened in both areas since. And there's much to be thought about as to why that is so, right? Why is that we find it so difficult to carry out police reforms and also prison reforms, and that can be another conversation. And I just want to respond to Mr. Jairam's question on right to justice versus right of the accused, right? Did I get that right, Jay? Right to life of the accused, right? Yeah. I think I would propose that the imagination of balance is the wrong imagery to invoke, generally, I would think, because I think balance then says towards which side do we need to lean more, right? And I think we are better off saying that there are legitimate interests on both sides, and what do we need to do differently to protect both those interests. I think we often, in questions of rights and constitutional adjudication, get into this balancing conversation, and that itself puts one against each other, right? And I think we are far better off not pitting one against the other, saying where is the balance of rights of victims versus right to life of the accused, right? I think both have equal value, right? And we need to find ways to respect both, right? And we can't say that that we would respect and protect rights of victims better if somehow we started inflicting harsher and harsher punishments on accused persons. Then, and I think there's a conversation to be had on to what that if victims want harsher and harsher punishments, is the state then justified in adopting that approach, saying that that's what victims want, so let's try and imagine harsher and harsher and harsher punishments, right? And I think that question leads back to what is the appropriate role for survivors and families of victims in criminal proceedings, right? And then there is that that there must be a role, yes, but what is the appropriate role at what stage, to what extent, are all difficult. I would think our conversations to be had with a little more consideration. Any more questions? Yeah, please come forward. Yeah. Just introduce yourself and then you can ask us.
Hi, I'm Qaish, and my question is, in what ways does the social context and reality of survivors affect their ideas of justice? And I ask this because I work on rural stories at the editorial desk, but I've had a very urban upbringing. So I just want to understand this.
Could you just repeat that once more, please?
In what ways does the social context and reality of survivors affect their ideas of justice? And I want to know this in the context of rural and urban survivors.
Okay, got it. Yeah, please. We'll come back. Corinne, we'll come back to that after we take a few questions. I'll give you that question. Don't worry. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Aparna. I think, Anup, you were the one who spoke about the burden of evidence needed by the system being immense when we ask for harsher and harsher penalties. So I want to know, maybe from Khushi, that in terms of like the death penalty cases typically happening over like 10 years, 20 years, that long to finally come to a conclusion, what is the impact on the, survivor through this process as you see it? And how does that sort of affect other survivors, willingness to report or, inclination to take it to the system?
Okay, thanks, Aparna.
Okay, my name is Vidya.
Right.
And it's a comment, really, not a question. But
Okay.
I'm glad you said what you did at the end, because I was hoping for a somewhat stronger connect between sexual violence and the death penalty as such, which was not. In this context, I was also hoping that we would talk a little bit about how reactive we've become. And this case of Priyanka, where this four young boys were shot off by a police officer. And that police officer then was so celebrated. If
You mean the Hyderabad case?
Yes, the Hyderabad one. Yeah. So when Bilkis Banu's, these 11 people were released, I got a lot of WhatsApp messages saying this is why they all had to be shot off at the beginning itself.
Right.
And so
Instant
it's
justice.
just a comment.
Instant justice.
Yeah. And then somehow this seems to rule. And this guy is celebrated for doing, killing off people. We don't know whether they raped that young lady or not, but they're all dead, 4 of them, So we
Yeah.
tend to have become very reactive these days.
Right.
With all these harsher and
Just name, please.
my name is Samir. Hi.
Samir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talking about all these harsher punishments, and there's a former DGP also on the panel here. What happens to a man who is wrongfully accused? Who comes to his help? Does the police come? That other institutions come to his help? Because I'm sure it does happen.
Yeah, I'll just set up a bunch of responses. I'm also just aware of the time. Corinne, to you, Khwaish, is that? Yeah. The question of does context matter, or the background of survivors and victims matter to their conception of justice, of what they want? Yes.
I think context and history are extremely important. And that is what we have let go in many, looking at the criminal justice system. The context of the crime and the history of the crime. We speak so much today of restorative justice. Now, restorative justice, you have there the Center for Restorative Justice, you have restorative justices, criminal tribunals for Cambodia, for Rwanda, in The Hague. On restorative justice, people are looking at restorative justice, but they are not contextualizing the justice or historicizing it. And this is an extremely important question that you bring up, because, I think that without contextualizing the justice, the injustice, and without historicizing it, we miss the crime. Think of Saddam Hussein. Think of why he was caught in that pothole and shot dead. Why could there not have been an Iraq tribunal and using the restorative justice system? And they said that they did it because he had gassed the Kurds. He has used the gas on the Kurds. But where did he get this kind of gas from? Nobody had given it to him. But then later on we learned that the Germans had given it to him. But Saddam Hussein had no neutron bombs, and he had no nuclear weapons or chemical weapons or biological weapons. So you used restorative justice there in Cambodia, where again, if you do not contextualize the crimes and you do not historicize them, restorative justice is just up in the air like this. So what we're trying to do in the courts is really change both. We're trying to look at reparation, at healing, at a justice that comes, that will restore in many ways.
Right.
So I like your question very much, and I'd like to meet you after this and talk a little bit more to you on this. This is the
Yeah.
one question that I wanted to say
Yeah.
something on. Did you need to
Yeah,
ask me?
there's one aspect of this that's reflected in the work or in the law on the death penalty increasingly, to say that we need to have a much more detailed background and context to the accused person. That's very limited, and I know you're talking of something way broader. But even there, the law struggles to come to terms with why is the background relevant and in what ways are certain aspects relevant, and this contextualizing, the law really struggles with it in the courtroom, and that's in a very limited context of what the law requires in death penalty law, and as I said, I acknowledge that what you're saying is broader. Aparna's question, Kushi, was that, when you talk of introducing the death penalty into things like the POCSO, right, because then connecting to what Jairam was asking, then there is a question of rights of accused as well. Then once the death penalty is in play, you also are risking that these cases will be litigated and dragged on for much longer, right? That it will go to stages and through hoops that otherwise those cases might not have gone through, right? You have a trial court, you have a high court confirmation, you have a Supreme Court appeal, you have a Supreme Court review, you have a mercy petition, you have the challenging of the rejection of the mercy in the High Court, you have the challenging of the rejection of the mercy in the Supreme Court, right? So, it prolongs this legal process and in that sense suffering. What does that do to survivors?
We don't even need to go to death penalty. The fact that a person who has filed a case has to wait for a minimum of 2 to 3 years to get justice, in the
Yes.
hope of justice, that itself is a long duration
Long.
of time, because
Right.
we're not allowing them to move forward, we're not allowing them to heal. We want them to hang on to their memories, because there is a gap between the time the person has given their evidence and then the cross-examination happens. And in the larger cities, I think this is much more difficult. In the rural settings, I think maybe pendency is not so high, so it's a little better. But I think in cities and stuff, it's much worse. Where is, I don't know if the person at all feels that, like in a very recent situation, the offender was found guilty. Maximum number of convictions go to appeal. Very, very few acquittals the families bother going to appeal. They don't have the bandwidth. They're saying, like, forget it, man. I mean, what is the point now? So by the time it goes to appeal, in this particular case, in a matter of about 3 to 4 months, the High Court had overturned the conviction of the Sessions Court. So now, when I thought that the mother would be done with this and she would say, like, yeah, okay, let's move forward. She said, no, if there's a way to take this to the Supreme Court, let's take it to the Supreme Court. Of course, they don't have a huge role to play in the matters before the High Court and the Supreme Court. There are other bodies that come into, or agencies that do that. But still, it is an anticipation. There is a hope. There is something that they're holding on to. And to what end? What do they get at the end of it? And then to be left with this thing that at 21, 22, 24, 25, this person is convicted for the rest of their life or there's death penalty. I don't know how much of satisfaction or justice they would feel at the end of that journey.
Right?
I know that some of the things we say are going to leave people much more confused than they walked into this room, but this is the nature of this particular.
Right. Yeah. Mr. Srikumar, Vidya's comment, and let me try and convert that into a question, right? What happened in Hyderabad, right? And you now have a Supreme Court appointed commission finding that it was an extrajudicial murder, right? Even if we had clinching evidence at the stage of the investigation and that those 4 persons did commit that crime, right? What did that celebration tell you? For you, what did it mean that so many people were celebrating an extrajudicial murder, right? What did it tell you about our relationship with the legal system? Yeah.
Let me tell you, Sri Kumar is an engineer from IIT Madras. and he the first policeman and probably the last policeman in this family in service. And I believe in justice. And I will tell you this, within about 15 days, probably 9th of January or something, we had a seminar in Central College compound where we talked about euphoria after the encounter. And I made 1, 2, 3, 4 points to say this is where the police have erred and they are not correct. They are not putting the correct picture. And it took High Court and Supreme Court to put a team of my ex-boss, Mr. Karthikeyan, also there,
Yeah.
and Supreme Court judge and
Sir
another
Court
High Court
judge.
judge.
Yeah, Sir Court
And they sat for 3 years to come to the same conclusion. And I read through the report, tried to find out, is it true that the 4 people were actually involved? I couldn't get any.
Does it matter?
It matters a lot. It matters a lot. Because this is where is the expectation coming from of the police, and which is wrong. I don't agree to it, I don't subscribe to it. That they are the agency of the state in front of the victim, and they are expected to wield the instant justice through the
Right.
medium of law.
Right.
So if you don't have a proper system, this is what, and that is why the euphoria came up. And the elite which has captured the power, they don't want, they just want to bring about, they don't want to bring about reform, they don't want to do anything. Every one of them wants the police as the tool.
Correct.
So that is why they are saying, we will give harsher punishment. Come on, you go and fill them up. And so many people have been bumped off as Naxalites or whatever it is. It is, I mean, this is a totally different thing. All this is stemming, and all this is turned against the police.
Right.
Whereas this is such a complex situation that, please understand this, the Police Act, the British brought into place to control power with just about 30,000-40,000 Englishmen in power, with all the lakhs and crores of people being counted. And we don't want to change that. Policemen have been crying hoarse saying that please change it. When I entered service in 1973, 3 battalions in UP Police, and incidentally I joined the UP Police immediately thereafter. They agitated for nice working condition and something which should allow them a little time to recuperate. Family life and things like that. But it didn't happen. And after that, in 1977, we had more serious police agitation. Then we had the police commission, and then committees, everything has gone in. But there is no effort by any party in power to bring about the reforms. Elections are going to come. Please ask both corruption and this. Both, you have to ask this question. Who are you going to do? Not the budget saying where you are going to get the freebies from. These are the questions of sustenance which is required. The polity of the society itself will not survive.
Yeah.
So much of division and so many things are happening. So we have to ask these questions. Say in your manifesto what you are going to do, when you are going to do, and then only you will get my vote.
Yeah.
We can't keep quiet.
Thank you. To Sameer's question of what happens to the wrongfully accused and the wrongfully convicted. I mean, let me just take that question and say that it's a bleak picture, Sameer. I mean, this year we've had 4 acquittals in the Supreme Court of people who were on death row for about 8 to 12 years. All acquitted after 2 courts gave them the death sentence. The Supreme Court finally acquitted them. Lives completely destroyed, right? What are they going back to, right? To their villages, their families. How do you even begin to make sense of the injustice that has been inflicted on them, right? And there's very little that can be done. And then one particular case that I want to highlight is what the Supreme Court said in this case called Adambhai Suleiman Ajmeri, which is the Akshardham blast case, where the Supreme Court finally acquitted all the accused and said that, and the Supreme Court explicitly acknowledged that all of them were framed by the police. And when these three individuals went back to the Supreme Court asking for compensation, the then Chief Justice, I think we're better off not naming him, the then Chief Justice said, right, we cannot allow this because allowing this would mean that the floodgates would open, right? It is a remarkable admission for a Chief Justice to make that there are so many cases in waiting of wrongfully convicted people that if you allow one, you would open the floodgates, right? So I don't think we talk enough in our system of wrongful convictions. Given the various pressure points in our criminal justice system, wrongful convictions are rampant. I don't think they're enough sufficiently documented, discussed, and worried about in our system. So it's a bleak picture there, Samir. No, I don't really have much to offer. That even when the court finds them to be wrongfully convicted, there is very little that the system is able to do to make any amends really, or any meaningful amends. We are past time. I know you have one. We can just take that last question and wrap up with that, please.
Thank you. I think that we've heard a lot about
Your name.
My name is Shyam.
Yeah.
I think we've heard a lot about how we need to build the capacity of the police, that there's an urgent need for police reform, especially infrastructurally. We've heard about the mindset of the society, the media, the regulators needing to change, and about how the police is playing a careful and deliberate role, which I felt was a bit surprising, where I felt like it was a bit antithetical to the citizen's experience, which is more in line with, I think, that one comment that ma'am said, which is about the fear of the citizen in terms of going to the police in the first place. And the reform of the mindset in the police themselves, in how they react to people who are coming expecting justice in the first place. So we spoke about restorative justice, how there is an expectation of how it was just slapped on the police, the 3-day rule to complete an investigation and so on. But what of the reform in the mindset of the police, which is in fact playing a deterrent in achieving or beginning the process of justice in the first place, where the citizens are so afraid of the police? What is being done to repair this fractious relationship between the police and the citizens? I would like to hear something about that. Thank you.
Shyam. Mr. Srikumar, how do we stop the fear of the police?
So I have practiced whatever I could do within the resources which I had with me.
Right.
And the same thing I am also saying, the change has to begin within, and we have to do it. I have a document on it and I want to take it forward, but then nobody will listen to me.
Nobody wants to.
Because I'll just cite one case, Gajraula nuns rape case. Some nuns were raped by a dacoit gang who committed dacoity. God bless his soul, he died yesterday. He was the chief minister. He came by a helicopter because hue and cry was there. And the police were asked to solve the case immediately. And after about 2.5 years of 7 people having been arrested and put behind bars, that case came to CBI and I handled that case. We had solid evidence to say that they were innocent. And they said they have to be released. And because of the paucity of time and the manipulation of evidence and so many things, we could not figure out as to who caused the agony to those nuns, victims. So only thing which you could do is, I put up a report saying that these accused have to be released and they cannot, we don't know who did it, but for the other things, wrong things, action has to be taken against them. The matter simply went into a basta khamoshi and that's the end of it. So that's the way the system behaves. So what do you do then? So one policeman, even if he wants to, cannot bring about change in his own domain. So that is why I would request, we need to have activism to bring about police reforms. And that is only one part of the reforms. That's why we have to talk about the complete criminal justice reforms.
Right.
So many things have, doctors who have, like I talked about Amarmani Tripathi case, the doctor who does the postmortem doesn't preserve the fetus. So what do you do?
Right.
So, because we wear the khaki and we can be identified with the state, so we are pilloried. But we are in shackles. Something has to be done now with the police reforms.
Corinne, any last comments before we wrap up?
No, thank you very much,
Much.
Anu. Thank you, and everybody for all the questions and for all that you have said. I'd like to tell those of you who want to listen to a story, if you want me to.
Yes.
But it's time.
It's time.
It's time now. So for the next time, okay? Thank you.
Khushi?
I think this mindset, we put a lot of responsibility on the police. Police are just one of the cogs in the wheel. Everyone is from the same mindset. I think all of us, including the public, including the judiciary, the medical officers, across the board, we sit with such wrong notions and in positions of power where we allow our egos and stuff to come in the way of sometimes it's not even a victim of this thing. It's about, I have to get this conviction or I have to get this acquittal. So it's not even looked at it from for the case for what it is. But in terms of winding up and closing down, I think prevention is the key. I think talking about sexual violence and empowering people to be able to speak about sexual violence and to even, and the message going out very strongly to potential offenders that there are very strong punishments. I think that's where we can start.
Right.
Okay, I can tell one.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
I'll tell the story from what Khushi just said just now. That the paradigm is so pervasive. And the thinking, the mindset, we talk about lawyers changing their mindset, police changing the mindset, NGOs changing the mindset. But this little story of Supriya came during the time when Gautama Buddha was preaching in the land of Shravasti. This is the imaginary Gautama Buddha, an imaginary Shravasti land. But the land was filled with drought and with famine, and people were hungry and people were thirsty, but they were listening to him, listening to Gautama Buddha. And Gautama looked at the followers and said, he said, the people are so hungry, can anybody feed them? And he just looked around him and he saw Dharampal, and Dharampal had vast lands, and he said, what about you, Dharampal? And Dharampal said, no, my lord, the king has taken away all my money in taxes and this, that, and the other. And then he looked at Srivastava, and then he said also, but I have to pay so much of my land in taxes, and I have to give so much of my money in taxes, I cannot do anything. And then he looked at another landlord and another landowner, and this, that, and the other, and they all said no to him. And suddenly there was some little hand at the back of the hall and at the back of the big place where he was preaching, and this was the hand of Supriya, the beggar's daughter. And she put her hand up and she said, I, my lord, I will feed them. I will feed the people. And she walked up and they all looked at her and said, how could she feed the people? Where will she get the money from? Where will she get anything from? She's after all the beggar's daughter. And she said, my gifts I will get at each of your doors. What was Supriya really telling them? You don't have to give. Even if you don't have, you give. Because you will get it at each of these doors. That is changing the paradigm. That's what Khushi talked about when she said to change the paradigm. That's what I talked about. And that's what Shiv in his own way is also talking about. But there are many changes that are coming with the police. I think so. But they have to change the paradigm. They have to listen to Supriya, the beggar's daughter.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm glad we ended with that story. And there's nothing I can say that can make us reflect more. So thank you so much for such a fantastic conversation, which I'm sure has left many of us thinking and perhaps a lot more confused, as you said, than we came in. And I assume if we've done that, we've done the job for the evening. If we've asked, we've made many of you reflect and question your positions and think about why you have certain positions, I think it's an evening well spent. Thank you once again to the Bangalore International Center for hosting this conversation. It's much appreciated. And thanks for staying and for your time today. And goodbye. And I hope you have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.